In a sealed evidence box, untouched for decades, sat threads pulled from the most controversial object in the history of religion. Tiny fibers, barely visible to the naked eye, lifted from the Shroud of Turin back in 1978 by a team of scientists who never got the technology they needed to fully understand what they were holding. For nearly 50 years, those samples sat in storage, waiting. And then, earlier this year, a team of Italian geneticists finally ran the test nobody had been able to run before, a full genetic sweep of everything trapped inside that cloth. And what they found split the world into two completely different stories. One story says, this cloth tells the story of a body that traveled out of the Middle East, soaked in the salt of the Dead Sea, exactly where the Gospels say a crucified man was laid to rest. The other story says, this cloth has been touched, breathed on, prayed over, and contaminated by thousands of hands across 1,000 years, until almost nothing pure is left to test. Both of those stories came out of the exact same data. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly what scientists actually found, what they did not find, and why people are calling this the most important shroud research in decades. For 2,000 years, this single piece of linen has survived fires, theft, wars, and relocation across an entire continent, ending up exactly where it sits today, inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. Millions of pilgrims have stood in line just to glimpse it through protective glass. Popes have spoken about it with carefully chosen words, never quite confirming, never quite denying. And every few years, like clockwork, a new round of scientific testing reignites the exact same argument that has never actually gone away since the first serious investigations began over a century ago. Is this the actual burial cloth that wrapped the body of Jesus Christ after the crucifixion, bearing the literal imprint of his face and wounds? Or is it an extraordinarily convincing medieval creation built by hands that understood exactly how to manipulate faith, devotion, and the limits of the science available at the time? This year, that argument got a new chapter, and it's one of the strangest, most genuinely uncertain chapters the Shroud has ever produced. To understand why this new study matters, you have to understand the wound this research was trying to heal. Back in 1988, a team of scientists took a tiny snip from a corner of the shroud and ran it through radiocarbon dating, the same method used to age fossils and ancient artifacts. The result landed like a bomb on the Catholic world. The test came back placing the cloth somewhere between the years 1260 and 1390, squarely in the medieval period, over 1,000 years after the crucifixion was said to have taken place. For decades, that single test became the go-to argument for anyone who wanted to dismiss the shroud as a clever forgery, a medieval painting or print designed to fool pilgrims. But the test was never as clean as it sounded. Critics pointed out almost immediately that the corner sampled in 1988 happened to be an area known to have been repaired and rewoven over the centuries, possibly contaminated with newer threads stitched in during restoration work, which could easily throw off a radiocarbon result by hundreds of years. The argument never fully went away. Believers kept pushing for new tests with better technology. Skeptics kept insisting the case was closed, pointing out that 3 separate respected laboratories all independently arrived at roughly the same medieval date range, which is normally the kind of agreement that ends a scientific debate rather than prolonging one. And yet it never actually ended, because the history of the shroud itself is full of documented gaps and disasters that make any single sampling decision feel risky. The cloth survived a serious fire in 1532 that scorched and damaged sections of it, requiring patches and repairs, sewn in afterward by nuns tasked with preserving it. It changed hands across multiple noble families and church authorities over the centuries, sitting in storage, traveling between cities, exposed to smoke, humidity, and handling that left visible scorch marks and water stains still present on the cloth today. Any one of those events could theoretically have introduced newer material into the specific corner that was eventually chosen for the 1988 test. For almost 40 years, neither side had anything new powerful enough to change the conversation. And the debate essentially froze in place, with both camps simply repeating the same arguments to anyone who would listen. That's exactly what makes 2026 different. A team led by Gianni Barcaccia, a professor of genetics and genomics at the University of Padua, working alongside Alessandro Achilli from the University of Pavia, finally got access to run full genetic sequencing on those decades-old 1978 samples. Not a narrow test looking for one specific thing. A complete genetic sweep, searching for every trace of biological material hiding inside the fibers of the cloth, whether it came from humans, animals, plants, or microorganisms. This is the kind of test that simply didn't exist in any usable form back when the shroud was last seriously examined. And when the results came back, they were almost too strange to be useful at first glance, because the cloth wasn't carrying one clean genetic signature. It was carrying dozens of them, layered on top of each other like sediment, each one representing a different point of contact across the centuries. Here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating. When the researchers isolated the human DNA specifically, they found something that immediately reignited the authenticity debate. The genetic material broke down geographically in a way nobody fully expected. A majority of it, somewhere in the range of 55 to 60%, traced back to populations from the Near East. A surprisingly large portion, close to 40%, traced back to genetic lineages associated with India, and only a small sliver under 5% traced back to Europe at all. So you think about what that actually implies. If this cloth had simply been manufactured in medieval Europe the way skeptics have argued for decades, you would expect the human genetic fingerprint left behind by centuries of European handlers, restorers, priests, and pilgrims to dominate the sample. Instead, the strongest genetic signal points toward the exact region where the crucifixion is said to have taken place, with a second, completely unexpected signal pointing toward India, a detail that lines up with old theories about the linen itself possibly being woven from flax processed along ancient trade routes that connected the Middle East to South Asia. And the human DNA wasn't the only thing that pointed toward the Holy Land. Buried inside those same fiber samples, researchers identified genetic traces of microorganisms that specifically thrive in extremely salty environments, the kind of environment you find around one place on Earth more than almost anywhere else, the Dead Sea. For something to carry the genetic fingerprint of Dead Sea level salinity, it has to have spent real time in that exact kind of environment, soaking in it, sitting near it, being exposed to it directly. That detail alone is part of why some researchers are treating this study as meaningful evidence supporting a Middle Eastern origin for the cloth, regardless of whether you believe the image itself is the body of Jesus or not. The geography keeps pointing in one direction, over and over, across multiple completely independent types of evidence pulled from the exact same fibers. But before you get too far ahead of yourself, here's the part of the story that the more excited headlines tend to leave out entirely. This DNA study did not date the cloth. It cannot tell you whether the shroud is 2,000 years old or 800 years old. Genetic material doesn't carry a built-in timestamp the way carbon isotopes do. What it can tell you is where the genetic material likely came from, not when it arrived there. So even the most exciting findings in this study, the Near Eastern dominance, the Dead Sea microorganisms, the Indian genetic signature, all of it is fully compatible with two very different explanations. It's compatible with the idea that the cloth originated in 1st century Judea and slowly made its way to Europe over centuries, picking up these genetic fingerprints along a long documented historical journey. But it's also compatible with the idea that the cloth, whenever and wherever it was actually made, simply passed through the hands of pilgrims, traders, and travelers from those exact regions at some later point in its history, picking up the same genetic fingerprints without ever having actually wrapped a body in 1st century Jerusalem at all. And that uncertainty is exactly why the scientific community didn't universally celebrate this study the way some religious outlets did. Outside experts who reviewed the findings raised serious concerns almost immediately. One biological anthropologist, speaking publicly about the research, pointed out that the methods used to identify plant and animal DNA in the sample rely on a kind of preliminary matching technique that's well known throughout the genetics field for generating false positives, meaning the software can mistakenly flag DNA as belonging to one species when it actually came from something else entirely, especially when working with degraded, centuries-old genetic material that's been exposed to heat, light, and handling for generations. On top of that, the study has not yet gone through formal peer review. It currently exists as a preprint, a draft shared publicly before other independent scientists have had the chance to scrutinize the methodology line by line and either confirm or challenge the conclusions. That doesn't mean the findings are wrong. It means the findings are not yet settled. And anyone telling you this study definitively proves anything is getting ahead of where the actual science currently stands. It gets even messier once you look past the human DNA and into everything else hiding in those fibers. Alongside the human, microbial, and Dead Sea signatures, researchers also pulled out a strange and almost comical list of genetic contaminants, traces of carrots, traces of bread wheat, other crop DNA scattered throughout the sample, genetic material from cats, from dogs, from cattle, from deer. None of that belongs in a 2,000-year-old burial cloth in any pure, untouched sense, and none of the researchers are claiming it does. What it actually demonstrates is centuries of constant human contact, candles burning nearby during religious processions, animals present in churches and storage spaces over hundreds of years, food residue from the countless hands that have touched, carried, displayed, and venerated this cloth across centuries of recorded history. In a strange way, this is the most honest part of the entire study, because it strips away the fantasy of a perfectly preserved, untouched ancient relic and replaces it with the much messier, much more human reality of an object that has been physically present in the world, passed from place to place for a very long time, accumulating evidence of ordinary daily life everywhere it went. Picture every single thing that has happened around this cloth across the centuries that we actually have documented. Cardinals carrying it through cathedral processions, restoration teams handling it with bare fingers long before anyone understood the concept of genetic contamination, public displays where it was unrolled in front of crowds, breathed on by thousands of people pressing close to get a better look. None of those moments were ever meant to preserve a pristine genetic sample. They were moments of devotion, ceremony, and ordinary human curiosity, and every single one of them left something behind. The DNA study didn't uncover a flaw in the Shroud story. It uncovered exactly what you'd expect to find inside any object that has survived in the real world for centuries instead of sitting sealed in a vacuum. Now, let's talk about the part of this story that gets people the most excited, and the part where you have to be the most careful, because this is where genuine science starts blending with assumption. Blood. For decades, long before this new DNA study ever existed, other scientists examining the Shroud claimed to find traces of human blood along the image, concentrated specifically around areas that would correspond to wrist wounds, a wound in the side, and marks across the scalp, consistent with a crown of thorns. Some of that earlier research even claimed to identify a specific blood type, type AB, present in the stains. To religious believers, this has long been treated as powerful, almost undeniable evidence connecting the image directly to a real crucified body. But here's the part that rarely makes it into the dramatic headlines. Other scientists who examined the same red coloring reached the exact opposite conclusion. A separate analysis, conducted decades ago by a different research team using microscopy, argued that the red material wasn't blood at all, but rather a pigment consistent with iron oxide, the same basic compound used in centuries of religious artwork to depict blood and wounds. That disagreement was never fully resolved. It split. The scientific community then, and this new 2026 DNA study, focused as it was on contamination and geographic origin, didn't settle that argument either. The blood question remains exactly where it's been for nearly 50 years. Unresolved, contested, and still capable of supporting two completely opposite conclusions, depending on which research team you choose to trust. And it's worth sitting with why that disagreement has never actually been settled by anyone in nearly half a century of trying. Blood, once it ages for centuries, breaks down chemically in ways that make it genuinely difficult to distinguish from certain mineral pigments using older testing methods, especially on a sample as small and as carefully protected as anything taken from the Shroud. Researchers on both sides of this argument aren't fringe figures making things up. They're trained scientists using legitimate laboratory techniques, looking at the exact same physical evidence, and walking away with conclusions that flatly contradict each other. That alone should tell you something about how genuinely difficult this object is to study with total certainty, even decades after the testing began, even with every new generation of equipment promising to finally settle the question once and for all. Then there's the image itself, the haunting, faint outline of a bearded man's face and body that has captivated millions of people for centuries, regardless of what any DNA test ever finds. Separate from the genetics entirely, other researchers over the decades have studied the wound patterns visible across the image using forensic and medical analysis, the same kind of techniques you'd use to investigate an actual crime scene. Some of those researchers have argued that the apparent blood flow patterns on the image are remarkably consistent with how blood would realistically move across a real human body under the effects of gravity during a slow, prolonged crucifixion, including specific details about wrist wound placement that some researchers argue would have been difficult for a medieval artist working centuries before any sophisticated understanding of human anatomy to fake convincingly. One detail that keeps coming up in these arguments involves the nail wounds themselves. The image appears to show wounds through the wrists rather than through the palms, which lines up with what forensic researchers say would have actually been necessary to support a body's weight during a real Roman-style crucifixion, since a nail through the palm alone would likely tear through soft tissue under that much sustained weight. Medieval artists, by contrast, almost universally painted crucifixion wounds through the palms, following centuries of religious artistic convention rather than physical reality, which defenders of the Shroud's authenticity argue makes it an unusual detail for any forger to have gotten right by accident. That argument has real defenders inside serious academic circles, but it also has real critics who point out that skilled artists across history have produced convincingly anatomical religious imagery without any forensic training at all, that a handful of medieval depictions of wrist wounds do exist if you look hard enough, and that pattern recognition can sometimes find meaning in randomness, especially when the viewer already wants to find it. Separately, a more recent and far more controversial theory has emerged suggesting the entire image could have been created using a three-dimensional carved relief or sculpture pressed against the cloth, rather than any direct contact with an actual human body, living or dead. That theory faced immediate and forceful pushback from other researchers who studied the image's fine details and concluded the sculpture explanation doesn't fully account for everything visible on the cloth. None of these debates have been settled by anyone, on any side, at any point in the last several decades. So where does that actually leave the dramatic headline that this new study shocked the Vatican? Here's the truth, stripped of the exaggeration. The Catholic Church, officially, has never taken a doctrinal position on whether the Shroud of Turin is the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It's treated as an object of veneration, not a required article of faith. Catholics are free to believe it's authentic or to believe it isn't, without either position putting them outside official church teaching. When this new DNA research came out earlier this year, the Vatican's own news outlet covered it in a relatively measured way, reporting on what the researchers found, without declaring it definitive proof of anything. There was no emergency meeting, no crisis of faith inside Vatican walls. What actually happened was something far less dramatic, but in its own way, far more interesting. A respected genetics team ran a test nobody had been able to run before, on samples that had been sitting in storage for nearly 50 years, and the results reopened a conversation that scientists, historians, and theologians have been circling for almost 2,000 years, without making that conversation any less complicated than it already was. And maybe that's actually the most honest way to look at this whole story. Every single time new technology gets pointed at the Shroud of Turin, it produces more data, more detail, more genuine scientific intrigue, and somehow, every single time, it still manages to avoid delivering a clean, final answer. The 1988 carbon dating was supposed to settle things, and instead, it kicked off decades of arguments about contamination and sampling errors. A 2024 analysis using a completely different dating technique based on the structural aging of the linen fibers themselves rather than radioactive carbon reportedly pushed the estimated age back toward roughly 2,000 years old, directly contradicting the medieval dating from 1988, and immediately drawing its own wave of scientific skepticism about whether that newer method is even reliable enough to trust. Now, this DNA study has added an entirely new layer of geographic and biological evidence, pointing strongly toward the Middle East, while simultaneously proving the cloth has been thoroughly contaminated by centuries of ordinary human contact. Every test adds more pieces to the puzzle. None of them have ever assembled into a complete picture that satisfies everyone. Here's what we actually know, with real confidence, after everything that's been discovered through 2026. We know the cloth carries human genetic material whose strongest signal points toward the Near East rather than Europe, which is at minimum consistent with, even if it doesn't prove, a Middle Eastern origin story. We know it carries traces of organisms that specifically thrive in salt-saturated environments, like the Dead Sea region. We know it also carries unmistakable evidence of centuries of ordinary contamination from food, animals, and countless human hands, which complicates any clean narrative in either direction. We know the question of whether the reddish staining on the cloth is actual human blood or simply pigment remains exactly as unresolved today as it was decades ago. And we know that no DNA test, no matter how advanced it ever becomes, will ever be capable of definitively proving that any specific genetic trace, no matter how compelling, belonged to one particular man who lived and died 2,000 years ago. That kind of certainty simply isn't something genetics, on its own, is built to deliver, no matter how badly people on every side of this debate want it to. What this story really reveals, underneath all of the headlines about shocking the Vatican and decoding the Crucifixion, is something a lot more interesting than a simple yes or no answer. It reveals an object that has somehow managed to remain scientifically unresolved for nearly 2,000 years, despite every advance in dating technology, every leap forward in genetic sequencing, every new generation of researchers absolutely convinced their tools would finally be the ones to settle it once and for all. Maybe that's exactly why this cloth refuses to fade out of the public conversation, no matter how many decades pass. It sits in this strange, permanent middle ground between faith and evidence, never fully confirmed, never fully debunked, constantly producing just enough new data to keep both believers and skeptics absolutely convinced they're the ones closer to being right. Consider for a moment how unusual that actually is. Most historical mysteries eventually get resolved once the right technology arrives. Lost shipwrecks get located by sonar, ancient handwriting gets identified through forensic analysis. Disputed artworks get authenticated through chemical dating of their pigments. The Shroud has been hit with practically every major scientific advancement of the last 100 years. Radiocarbon dating, electron microscopy, spectral image analysis, and now full genomic sequencing. And instead of converging toward one clear answer, the evidence keeps splitting further apart, generating new questions just as fast as it answers old ones. That pattern alone, repeating across nearly a century of formal scientific investigation, is almost as strange as anything actually printed onto the linen itself. The 2026 study didn't end that conversation. If anything, it added fuel to it, handing both sides a fresh batch of evidence that somehow manages to support whatever conclusion you were already leaning toward before you watched this video. Believers now have a genuine genetic signal pointing toward the Near East and the Dead Sea to point to. Skeptics now have confirmed undeniable centuries of contamination and an unreviewed, disputed methodology to point to instead. Both sides walked away from the exact same laboratory results, feeling more confident than they did before the study was even published, which might be the single most telling detail in this entire story. And maybe, after everything science has thrown at this single piece of linen across nearly 2 millennia, that's simply what the Shroud of Turin actually is. Not a mystery waiting to be solved. A mirror reflecting back exactly what each new generation of researchers, believers, and skeptics was already looking to find.